Hello and welcome into the 247 Sports College Football Show. I'm Cooper Petagna alongside 247 Sports Director of Scouting Andrew Ivins. Drew, we're less than 3 weeks away from the college football season. Fall camp is ramping up. And why not start the show with the hot take? Is the next Patrick Mahomes already here in college football? I mean, look at this. Dylan Raiola, the five-star on campus in Lincoln, Nebraska. I don't know if you've seen the picture. I mean, the similarities there, Drew. Look at it on camera. I thought that was Pat Mahomes the first time I saw it. There's Mahomes commenting. That's my little cuzzo. I mean, is the next Pat Mahomes here, Drew?
Tyreek Hill was commenting as well. I mean, Adidas athletes, both of them wearing the three-stripe logos. Coop, I mean, me and you have had so much exposure to Dylan Raiola throughout the entire recruiting process and the evaluation process. And, you know, I comped him to Ben Roethlisberger at times, but I think there are some similarities between Patrick Mahomes and Dylan Raiola. You go back to the senior tape, right? Dylan's a guy that will also drop his arm. You know, those side angles that have made Patrick Mahomes such a star, such a commodity in the NFL. That shows up a little bit, I think, in Dylan Raiola's game when he was at Buford High School, and we saw him at the Elite 11 finals. They're built kind of similar. I'm not sure Dylan Raiola is as athletic as Patrick Mahomes, but yeah, it's a fun way to kick off the college football season.
Yeah, a little context on there. Dylan Raiola, the son of Dominic Raiola, played 11 years in the league, All-American at Nebraska. Now Dylan Raiola, formerly committed to Georgia and Ohio State. Big expectations this year. That leads into our conversation. Freshman quarterbacks that could have a potential impact in year one. Let's start with Raiola in terms of what's kind of reasonable for him under Matt Rule. You look at Nebraska, they had one of the worst passing offenses last year. They had one of the worst offensive lines when it came to protecting the quarterback. Is this a situation for him to come in and excel? Drew, I should mention the first 4 games at home, then you got Purdue on the road. It's pretty favorable in terms of navigating that early schedule for a freshman quarterback.
Well, Coop, I mean, you know this. You worked at Oregon, you worked at Michigan, you've ran personnel departments around the country. You never want to go into a season expecting to start a true freshman quarterback. That is not a recipe for success. With that being said, Nebraska couldn't throw the football last year. They had no spark on offense. And in comes Dylan Raiola, who is the highest-ranked signee for the program in the modern recruiting era. I mean, I'm sure we could go back to the 50s and 60s, and maybe there was another 5-star out there, but Dylan Raiola is it. And everyone that knows Nebraska football from this point moving forward, the question is going to be, when is Dylan Raiola going to be ready to go? And, you know, I think for a guy, normally you would say, I don't know if you want to start him week 1, but in Dylan Raiola's case, this is a kid that was at multiple high schools throughout the recruiting process. For us, that's normally a red flag. You don't want to see these guys bouncing around. But for him, when he showed up at Buford High School there in Georgia, one of the top programs, he learned the offense in 6 weeks. What does he do as a senior? 250 passes, only 1 interception, 34 touchdown passes. I think his ability to pick up the offense is going to help here when it comes to him in Lincoln.
Yeah, one of those rare situations where you look at a kid in high school playing at multiple programs where you kind of think, all right, that's a little bit of a negative. Why is he moving? You know, but that's kind of where we are in this era of high school sports, college sports as well. Dylan Raiola, maybe a positive, right? He's going to have to pick up a new offense. Drew, the other thing I want to ask, like, what does a successful rookie season look like for this quarterback in Nebraska who's got, let's be quite frank, a lot of expectations going into year 2 under Matt Rule?
Him winning some games, getting to a bowl game, I think there's going to be some lumps that come with Dylan Raiola. Again, you know, someone we've seen a bunch, had a ton of exposure to. You know, he's someone that doesn't take risks, and the interception rate shows that. But he'll take some sacks, right? And I think he can create off schedule, and he can, you know, buy himself some chances. But I think there's absolutely going to be some lumps. And having spent time around him, I think the biggest question mark is that confidence, right? How is he wired between the ears? What happens when adversity hits? What happens when you throw an interception against UTEP? Are you going to come out there and are you going to still fire into some passing lanes? So I think for him, you know, a successful season, getting them to the bowl game.
One of the best deep ball throwers I think we've seen in quite some time. Gets me excited about Malachi Coleman, a former top 247 receiver. So a lot of expectations for Dylan Raiola. He was the number 2 quarterback according to 247 Sports. The number 1, DJ Lagway, Gatorade Player of the Year. Now he's on Gatorade commercials as well. We're fired up about this guy. Fans in Gainesville are fired up about this guy. How quickly, even with Graham Mertz there, can DJ Lagway impact Florida?
Well, you Look at the schedule, Cooper. I mean, it is a daunting one. This might be the hardest schedule ever for Florida. Billy Napier's in a key year. He needs to win games. And yeah, Graham Mertz, you mentioned him. This is a guy that I expect to be drafted next May. This is a guy that's going to come off day 2, day 3. I think Graham Mertz isn't the issue for Florida. With that being said, you have DJ Lagway coming in, who I think had the greatest high school season in America out of anyone last year. What we saw from him in terms of his ball placement, how he beat defenses with his arm and legs, it was special. A ton of footage. So what does Florida do? I think for Billy Napier, he needs to show the future. I think the pressure is going to be on to get DJ Lagway involved. And also, Cooper, where we are in college football, there's some financial investment from these programs with name, image, and likeness. I think the boosters there in Gainesville are going to expect to see some of DJ Lagway, and how do you get him involved? How about Florida back in 2006 when they won the national championship? Remember, they had Chris Leak, the veteran quarterback there, and they also had this guy named Tim Tebow. Okay, Tim Tebow ended up throwing 33 passes that season, but he almost ran for 500 yards. DJ Lagway, a kid in high school, almost ran for 1,000 this past year. So I think he's someone you can find ways to get him involved. And, if Graham Mertz were to get hurt, then you just turn the keys over to DJ Lagway.
Gauntlet of a schedule. I think the number one ranked toughest schedule by our Brad Crawford here at 247 Sports. You got Miami to start the season. You got Central Florida in the first 5 weeks as well. And then you go to November. Look at this 5-game stretch. Georgia, Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, and Florida State. And this is a make or break year for Billy Napier. The guy that comes to mind for me, if you're looking at a guy to say, all right, who is the guy that we could potentially model off of in terms of the learning curve for DJ Lagway? How about Avery Johnson, right? And a guy that's got a lot of expectations going into year 2, but he backed up Will Howard. There was no type of pressure for him to come in as a freshman and have that type of impact. Obviously, DJ Lagway is the number one quarterback in the country. There are expectations there. But if Florida goes, 3-2, Drew, I think that's the point of the season where you're like, all right, we got to give this guy more runway. Maybe you build for the future. I think a big part of Billy Napier outside of winning football games is to be able to show his hand and say, hey, we got building blocks of the foundation here. If you're going to keep me around, these are the type of dudes that you're betting on. He's got some guys, both offense and defense, but I think he's got to find a way to show his cards with DJ Lagway early.
Yeah, and you're talking about Avery Johnson at Kansas State, ended up starting in the Pop-Tart Bowl for them, and you said it, he's one of the hottest names here. So, no, absolutely, I agree. I think DJ Lagway, the other thing, Cooper, is the more you talk about him being involved in some certain packages, Miami's now got to prepare for him week 1. Tennessee later on in the season. Georgia, you keep kind of, dangling it out there for opposing defensive coordinators that, hey, we might have a quarterback that can come in and keep you honest because he can beat you with his legs as well.
I think he's simply too good not to play early. So we'll see what happens with DJ Lagway. Certainly a big year in Gainesville for Billy Napier in the Gators. Let's go to the number 3 quarterback, another 5-star, Julian Sayin, a guy that signed with Alabama. Nick Saban steps down, retires, shocks the college football universe. Now he's off to Ohio State. He's married up with Ryan Day and Chip Kelly. Interesting situation. That guy we just talked about, Will Howard, well, guess what? He adds a lot of experience to Ohio State's quarterback room. Enter Julian Sayin. Drew, Ohio State's all in. You look at all the acquisitions they made. Caleb Downs comes over the portal via Alabama as well. You look at guys like Quinshon Judkins, one of the best running backs in the country. Seth McLaughlin from Alabama. They have fortified this team, especially offensively, one of the best defenses in the country. Is there a chance, any chance at all, that we see Julian Sayin sometime this year, if those expectations, now you got a 12-team playoff, right? It's not that small margin of error with only 4 teams in the CFP. Hey, if things get a little bit dicey, are we going to see the freshman here?
Well, I think there's 2 things here. Number one, you're only as good as your backup quarterback. Ask Florida State about that. So I think Ohio State, they're going to want to show that they have someone else besides Will Howard. The second thing, the buzz on Julian Sayin so far behind the scenes is through the roofs. Yes, Jeremiah Smith, the 5-star wide receiver, he's now there in Columbus. He's the one that turned heads. But Julian Sayin, I keep hearing it, right? If this guy gets on the field, he might not relinquish the job. Kind of reminds me of when Tua Tagovailoa was backing up Jalen Hurts at 2018 in Alabama. We saw some of Tua in games. He ends up stepping in there in the college football playoff and being named offensive MVP of the title game. So I fully expect him. I don't know what you think about Julian Sayin. He's a bit different than these other quarterbacks we've mentioned, but at the end of the day, 212 passes as a senior, only 1 interception. This is a guy that had the highest completion percentage amongst the blue chippers. And the other thing that stands out, Cooper, he can operate under center. He's not some guy that has just played in a very simple offense.
Further ahead, Elite 11 MVP. I think he surprised us when we saw him in California last year. This is a guy, a lot of expectations there in Columbus. All right, 2 other guys, Drew, that we want to get to. Walker White at Auburn. We love this guy. We got to see him in San Antonio at the All-American Bowl. But the offensive MVP in San Antonio at the All-American Bowl, Damon Williams, signed with Arizona. Jed Fish goes to UW. He goes with him to Seattle. Why do you think those 2 guys could be 2 really interesting names to keep an eye on?
I'm going to let you tee off here on Walker White. That's your guy. You compare him to Will Levis. But Damon Williams, look, Washington, it's a full rebuild. We saw them in the national title game. Everyone has left. They returned 2 starters. I think it's another situation where you want to show what the future has. Damon Williams kind of reminds me a little bit stylistically of Noah Fafita, who Jed Fish had at Arizona. This is a guy that passed for over 3,000 yards as a senior, ran for over 1,000 yards. He's got track speed. He's on the smaller side, but he can create some magic. So to me, depending on how it goes early on in the season for the Huskies, who are moving to the Big Ten, I think he's a name that's a sneaky name to keep an eye on as a potential freshman All-American quarterback.
All right, we're going to talk a little Walker White after the break, as we're going to talk some generational wide receivers as well. Cam Coleman, Auburn Tigers in that group as well. We'll see you after the break. Generational recruiting class. Drew, that's what you called this cycle in 2024. Yes, I get them confused. We've got a lot of classes that we're studying right now. But you think about that. That word generational gets tossed around a lot. Jim Nagy, the director of the Senior Bowl, he was talking, he's like, that word just gets thrown around too much. This one, I think, has a pretty good case for saying, all right, this is one of the best receiving classes that we're going to see in a long time. Last year was guys like Kevin Concepcion. You go down the list, you see guys like Eric Singleton at Georgia Tech that were kind of guys outside of the top 247, more in that 3-star range, that were the heralded receivers as freshmen. This year, more than likely not going to be the case. The number 1 player in the country, Jeremiah Smith, Cam Coleman, top 5. I mentioned Walker White, Auburn. You go down the list, Ryan Williams, Ryan Wingo at Texas, and there's a handful of others that we can talk about. You and I were talking about it today at breakfast, and you said, Coop, Jeremiah Smith and Cam Coleman. Like, when's the last time we had 2 receivers like this that could arguably be the number 1 receivers at any other class? And it kind of got us to thinking, like, Julio Jones, maybe A.J. Green, those 2 came out together. Is that what we're looking at here with Jeremiah Smith and Cam Coleman?
Yeah, you go back to 2008, right? That's when A.J. Green and Julio Jones, like you said, they had really good freshman seasons. And I think football has changed here over the past decade. I mean, it used to be wide receivers had to wait their turn, and now more so with teams wanting to air it out, these guys are on the field. So like you said, in 2023, the freshmen that broke through or more of the 3-star prospects, that's not going to be the case here in 2024. Jeremiah Smith, Cam Coleman, those are the 2 at the top. I mean, Cam Coleman is a kid where you place him in any other recruiting class, any other recruiting cycle, he might be the number 1 player in the country. The only issue is there's this guy named Jeremiah Smith ahead of him. Jeremiah Smith, Coop, I go back to when we made the decision to make him number 1 overall. We were a bit uneasy about it. I'm sleeping a lot better lately because of all the practice reports that have come out of Columbus, all the video, all the footage of him making plays. And Ohio State, it's not like they haven't had any talent at wide receiver. This is zone 6, wide receiver U, whatever you want to call it. They have guys there. So the fact that Jeremiah Smith comes in and right away, as a guy that should have been in high school going to prom, is able to make a splash in spring practices, we're absolutely going to see him making plays here in 2024.
Julio Jones, All-Pro, probably going to be a Hall of Famer. One of those guys people look at, Atlanta mortgaged their entire future to trade up all those years ago to go get Julio Jones. He rewarded him. Is that crazy? Is that, I don't want to talk about pressure. It comes now with the game. But Jeremiah Smith, this is a guy you covered since he was a pup in the state of Florida. Is that crazy, or is that something that you think Jeremiah Smith is going to run to and be closer to a guy like Julio Jones than him not being that caliber of receiver?
I think the X factor for Jeremiah Smith is between the ears, how he's wired. I always say he's got a pro type of mindset. And it's so rare in this age of high school recruiting and all these prospects. I mean, with the name, image, likeness, and all the other compensation out there, so many guys are attracted to the wrong things, and I don't think that's the case with Jeremiah Smith. Having spent time around him when we named him the #1 player, he's someone that didn't really matter to him. He's still kind of pushing forward. And I think what's unique about him is, he's cousins with Geno Smith, the Seattle Seahawks starting quarterback. I just think the way that family has raised him and prioritized things is a lot different. So I think Jeremiah Smith is certainly living up to the hype. And every time I want to doubt him, he answers the call and does something. And we saw that at the All-American Bowl late in his career. It's going to be fun to see him and Cam Coleman. I know Cam Coleman's someone that you studied a lot, right? You were living in Alabama. We saw him there in the Yellowhammer State. I mean, what do you expect for him at Auburn, which hasn't had a 1,000-yard receiver since 1999?
Which is what, 25 years? Hey, that's a long time. I expect that guy, even if it's not this year, maybe the Peyton Thorne marriage doesn't work out the way that people expect for them to make sweet music and he's over 1,000 yards. This dude's going to be a household name very quickly. I think we saw it in the spring where, Auburn knew what they had in Cam Coleman. Then he gets there, and it's like, man, this guy's still 17 years old. He just got named on the 20 under 20 at 247 Sports. I expect huge things, Drew. And I think here's the thing. Like Jeremiah Smith, the #1 player in the country, we keep bringing it up. I think any other year, hands down, not even a conversation, there would be a huge gap between Cam Coleman and the next best guy. So I expect huge things. And it's not just Cam Coleman, right? If you're an Auburn fan, Perry Thompson, Bryce Cain, Malcolm Simmons. I mentioned Walker White. We're going to hit on. Like Walker White, you plug that guy in to that future receiving core for the Auburn Tigers, Drew. It reminds me of the days when Hugh Freeze was in Oxford and he had all those guys, A.J. Brown, Laquan Treadwell. You go down the list, D.K. Metcalf. I mean, they were loaded. That's going to be the identity of this team. It's taking what is perceived as a weakness over the last 25 years, and this ultimately, at the end of the day, is going to be the biggest strength of this Auburn team over the next 2 to 3 years.
Well, Jeremiah Smith, Cam Coleman, they're the headliners, but there's a third guy right behind them, Ryan Williams, and he's also on the younger side. He's 17 years old. He was a member of the 2025 recruiting cycle. He reclassifies into 2024. He's going to skip his year, senior year of high school. Usually for us, we're a bit hesitant about that because this is a guy that's missing out on key developmental years, right? You want to see them play those games. But Ryan Williams showed up at the Alabama-Mississippi All-Star game. He balled out. He showed up at the Under Armour All-America game in Orlando. He balled out. And you think about the Crimson Tide. Kalen DeBoer comes over from Washington. What did they do last season? They threw the football. They also threw it to a bunch of really good wide receivers. Alabama doesn't return a lot at that wide receiver position. And, Ryan Williams, he might be in the shadows behind Cam Coleman and Jeremiah Smith, but I think you would wager he's going to have a huge freshman campaign as well.
He's going to have to. Isaiah Bond, gone to Texas. Jermaine Burton, gone to the NFL. You go down the list. I mean, they lost 60-plus starts that they have to replace in that room. You got guys like Kendrick Law. You got guys like Kobe Prentice that can certainly step up, fill that void. Ryan Williams is the rare one where you look at his situation. You said, typically I wouldn't bet on a guy like this, early. Is it fair to have a guy ranked inside the top 10? And he should be a senior in high school. But guess what? Kalen DeBoer and a team that just was in the college football playoffs, they're going to have to rely on this early. Drew, the other thing that you brought up wasn't just Alabama, Mississippi. He showed up at the Under Armour game there in Orlando as well. The biggest thing for us is, you said it today, he was not a fish out of water. This is a dude that I think has already put on some good weight in a short amount of time since he's been in Tuscaloosa. He's an X factor. You mentioned Kalen DeBoer as well. Roma Dunze, Jalen Polk, Jalen McMillan. He brings over Jeremy Bernard from Seattle as well. This team is equipped. Jalen Milroe, you plug him in. Drew, I think they're going to have plenty of options, and the list kind of goes on. But let's talk about a team that needed some dogs, and they used to be that team that was kind of in that conversation with Ohio State as one of the best receiver rooms in the country. It's been a while since they've kind of been up there and back in those talks of a team that you would think of, all right, this team produces elite talent. Dabo Swinney, Clemson, man, they used to have all those guys. They were running neck and neck with Ohio State. They signed five-star TJ Moore, a guy that we loved at the All-American Bowl. Brian Wesco as well, a guy that we had as a five-star for quite some time. Those two dudes, they're going to have to play early. They're going to be relying on them. What do you think about what those guys can bring to the table day one?
Yeah, the Tigers, they don't use the transfer portal, right? Last year, their freshman class played 4,000 snaps or close to it. That led all of FBS, right? These guys have to be ready to go. And I think if you're a Clemson fan, the most encouraging thing coming out of spring practices is what Bryant Wesco was able to do, because we saw Bryant Wesco play as a senior. We saw him in the all-star setting. He was a little bit behind of TJ Moore, right, who really took over at the All-American Bowl. TJ Moore also had a heck of a senior season. He wasn't in for spring practices, and it's got me thinking, okay, if Bryant Wesco can come in and do what he was able to do during those 15 spring sessions, then just wait till TJ Moore gets there. You're absolutely right, Cooper. This reminds me of the Clemson wide receivers of old, right? When they had big perimeter winners on the outside, guys that could be vertical threats. These two are absolutely names to know. Cade Klubnik needs some weapons, and I think these two file them away for another day, and you're going to look up mid-season point. Both of them are going to be making plays there in the ACC.
All right, we said this was a generational class, right? And there you see it. 7 receivers ranked as 5 stars last year. That means there were 7 receivers with a first-round grade. Drew, we can wrap on this forever, but I'm going to kind of say dealer's choice here, man. Go down the list. Which one of these guys kind of stands out to you as like, hey, you know what? Year one, this is a name to watch.
I think it's Micah Hudson at Texas Tech, right? Highest-ranked signee ever for the Red Raiders. Joey McGuire, the head coach there, someone that had Micah Hudson circled throughout the recruiting process. You know, we saw him at the Under Armour All-American game, high volume target there in the Lone Star State. You know, this is another one, right, where you're trying to sell the future, these head coaches. And again, you have that financial component. These freshmen need to be able to go. It's just like NFL rookies, right? You're a first-round pick. You're expected to play year one. I think Micah Hudson's another guy, just like Cam Coleman, just like Jeremiah Smith, just like Ryan Williams. There is no adjustment period. You got to be a dude right away.
All right, real quick, tell me what you like about Nick Marsh.
Nick Marsh at Michigan State, right? That's one to keep an eye on. Michigan State also going through a full rebuild, had over 100 yards receiving in the Spartan spring game. He is a height, weight, speed monster, an outlier for 247 Sports. You play fantasy college football. I think Nick Marsh is one to target in the later rounds.
Receivers, the belle of the ball in this 2025 cycle. 2024, whatever, I keep getting mixed up. But guys, we got week 1 matchups that got our full attention right after this. Week 1, only a few weeks away, and the question that I think a lot of people are going to be asking, who needs it more, right? A lot of attractive matchups in that first week. Drew, we got to start. I mean, you're a Florida man, right? Florida, Miami, the Gators host the Canes in a huge week 1 matchup. The line right now, Miami, -2.5. Cam Ward, the transfer portal jewel, Damian Martinez. You go down the list, Miami kind of all in on year 3 under Mario Cristobal. A different kind of feel for Billy Napier, even though these two teams have kind of been in lockstep the first 2 years. I guess I'll just ask you that question. Who needs this game more, Billy Napier or Mario Cristobal?
I think it's Billy, right? In Florida, you look at Billy, 3-10 versus ranked opponents in his first 2 seasons. More notably, 1-7 against some of the rivals, Georgia, Florida State, Tennessee, and LSU. Miami, also an in-state rival. I think it's the Gators, and his seat is scorching hot here. You know, this time last year, Cooper, we were talking about Florida having a top 5 ranked recruiting class, and they finished with a pair of 5 stars in DJ Lagway and LJ McCray, but things derailed down the stretch. And then here in this 2025 recruiting cycle, they're sitting 60th in the rankings right now. They have not been anywhere close to what it has been in the past under Billy Napier. So to me, Florida needs this game because it is a difficult schedule, and they need to get some momentum as that's going to allow them to get some more prospects committed. I hear it all the time. You know, you talk with guys like Tom Loy at 247 Sports. I think a lot of recruits are hearing the noise about Billy Napier and his tenure and his future. So to me, I think this could be a bit of a signature win, if you can say that when you're on the hot seat, but it certainly would alleviate some pressure.
Billy Napier, 11-14 in 2 years. Mario Cristobal on the other side, 12-13. A loss for Miami in this game. Doesn't matter the fashion, just a loss. And this is a big matchup. I talked about Cam Ward, a lot of the investment in the roster as well. Like, people are still waiting for it to happen there in Miami. Year 3 is typically the year that we see the turnaround. We saw that with Mike Norvell. Would that make you a little concerned about the Mario Cristobal era there in Coral Gables?
Well, Coop, you used to work for Mario Cristobal, right? And you know he can dial it up for the big games. I was talking with someone yesterday that was at practice over the weekend. They thought it was one of the crispest and most efficient and most directed college practices that they had been a part of in their career. So, I think it would certainly sting. What are your expectations? Who are you taking at this point between Florida and Miami?
I mean, let's not shy away from this. I think you and I are always talking, hey, Cam Ward. I mean, like you look at this quarterback class right now, and I'm not trying to take away from it, but this is what I think about Cam Ward. Like Carson Beck is the guy right now that everybody has kind of circled as the potential #1 draft pick. You go down Milroe, Ewers, there's some options there. How about Cam Ward? I mean, I turned on the tape last year. I thought he was like a 3rd-round pick, potential day 2 guy, maybe early day 3. But this is a dude with everything around him and that offensive line and what they build, and Jalen Rivers and Francis Mauanoa. They got some really, really good pieces. That's the identity of this team. Then you talk about Damian Martinez, you talk about a Mark Fletcher. They're ready to go. Like, this is a plug-and-play roster situation. I think Florida's got some more holes than Miami does, but I expect this guy to be the turnkey. What Miami's been missing, ACC is kind of wide open, more wide open than it's been in a very long time. I think this is kind of the gateway potentially to a top 12 finish, a team that could potentially make the playoff as the ACC representative and win the ACC as well. It's a huge year, but this is the year. The other thing about Mario, if I remember from my time, he likes when he's doubted. That game where Oregon went to Columbus, beat Ohio State on their turf, that's what he's about. He's about this big game. I think there's expectations, obviously, coming into week 1, but I think Shannon Dawson, especially on the offensive side, they're going to let it rip. I mean, what do they have to lose? So Florida, Miami, certainly a fascinating game, not to mention the ripple effects of the recruiting will be felt for years after that as well. Another huge one, Clemson, Georgia. Week 1, I feel like this game's lost a little bit of its muster if you would have gone back 2 to 3 years ago and looked at this game. Now you got the Bulldogs trying to get back to win a national title. You got Clemson trying to figure out, are these guys for real going forward, or is Dabo and Clemson kind of taking a step back? Clemson right now plus 13.5 in that game, neutral site in Atlanta. Obviously going to be a lot of Georgia Bulldogs fans there. Drew, the biggest question mark, and I think coming out of spring, you and I talked about this, can Clemson block Georgia? I mean, this is a filthy defensive line, and Clemson, from an offensive line standpoint, they're still trying to figure things out under new offensive line coach Matt Luke.
I think the short answer is no. Matt Luke comes over, right, former interim head coach there at Ole Miss, and he is known as one of the top O-line coaches in the industry. I think it was a huge hire for Dabo Swinney because he went outside of his normal coaching tree, right? That is rare for Dabo to do. Normally it's a lot of in-house type of promotions. He goes out and he makes that hire. But Cooper, I watched Clemson's spring game, and the first thing I thought is, how are they going to stop? How are they going to limit that Georgia front 7? I think the final total in that inter-squad scrimmage, right, and they split up the offensive lines. They gave up 21 tackles for loss, 11 sacks. Go back to this past season, Clemson, which again doesn't use the transfer portal. So they haven't brought in any veterans, any mercenaries, any plug-and-play type of guys. Against Miami, 24 pressures. Against Kentucky in the bowl game, 26 pressures, both those numbers from PFF. Do you think Georgia's defensive line's better than Miami's? Do you think Georgia's defensive line's better than Kentucky's? I think the story of that game is going to be the point of attack. Can Clemson protect Cade Klubnik? Because if they can, it doesn't really matter.
It's going to be tough. And the other thing is, if Georgia were to cover here, like, what does that say about Dabo and the program? You and I, we obviously cover recruiting and have a good pulse on this. Every team in the country, really outside of Clemson, is dipping into the transfer portal as another lifeline to build their roster. We'll talk about the 85 to 105 later. Clemson seems very content to build through high school. But like you said, now you're in a position, you got Michael Williams, Nazir Stackhouse, Brinson, all these guys that you're going to have to account for. You're kind of sitting there, and the center position is a spot that they got to get right. I mean, what is it, like, philosophically, are you like, all right, we're starting to kind of see some breaks in the dam if Georgia wins this game in convincing fashion?
I think absolutely, right? Go back to a few years ago, and we got a recruiting background. Remember Dabo didn't do the summer official visits, and what did he do? He realized he had to adapt. And now Clemson every year, the first weekend of June, which is during that open period, they will host one of the biggest recruiting weekends in the country. We're talking 20, 30 official visitors, and that has worked out well for them. So, I think if they go out there and they get, ran out of the stadium there, maybe there is a recalibration. Hey, maybe we do need to open our doors to some transfer portal players because we have to plug holes. We can't do it with freshmen, especially when we're going to open up the season against a program like Georgia. So, yeah, that's certainly something I have my eye on. What does this result do? And what does it mean for the Tigers long term?
All right, another intriguing matchup taking place in Las Vegas. A Big Ten team versus SEC team. Still feels weird to say that. USC.
This feels like a game we created on like EA Sports 25.
The game is weird, and the teams kind of oddly mirror each other. We'll get to that in a second. But you got Miller Moss taking over for Caleb Williams, the #1 pick in the draft, former Heisman winner. Then you got Garrett Nussmeier, another redshirt junior, taking over for Jaden Daniels, the #2 pick in the draft, another former Heisman winner. You got two teams and two coaches that were brought in at the same time, Lincoln Riley and Brian Kelly. And you got two teams that had two of the worst defenses in all of college football last year. LSU is -6.5 right now. But let's start with those quarterbacks because both these guys, Drew, they've kind of gone a different route than what you see in college football. They've waited their turn. They've developed. Now it's time for them to take over the reins. Miller Moss versus Garrett Nussmeier. Like, if you had to place one guy where you're like, all right, you know what? I'm a little bit more confident in this guy heading into this game. Who would that be?
Well, the other thing, Cooper, is they both started the bowl games this past season. I think we're going to see that trend more and more with guys, opting out, getting ready for the NFL, not wanting to get hurt. Like, that's the new fad, right? You get your freshman quarterback and you play them in that bowl game if you're not in the college football playoff. And, both of them statistically in those bowl games look great. They both led their teams to victories. I'm buying stock in Garrett Nussmeier over Miller Moss, right? And to me, it's because of that offensive line in front of him. Will Campbell, Emory Jones, those are NFL guys, right? And I think the other thing that stands out about the LSU Tigers is that run game. Really bullish on Caleb Jackson, that running back. I think that's a name you need to know in the SEC. And they got a freshman coming in, Caden Durham. So to me, Garrett Nussmeier, I like him in this spot a little bit more than I do Miller Moss.
LSU, the other thing about the Tigers that I think is maybe a little bit overlooked in this game, Brian Kelly's 0-2 non-conference games to start the season since he's been at LSU. Florida State, both times. The first game of the season 2 years ago was kind of wacky. Florida State wins that one. Last year, they win in convincing fashion. This is kind of like a odd trip game for LSU. I think a lot of people obviously expect LSU to win this game, but Drew, if they don't, does that change your perception of kind of like year 3 Brian Kelly, what you thought this program would be, especially losing to a team that, quite honestly, physicality is not their MO in the Trojans?
Well, Blake Baker, the new defensive coordinator, comes in from Missouri. I think there's going to be a completely new look on defense. It's going to be fast. It's going to be physical. It's going to be aggressive. And I think they're going to be able to squeeze the most out of that front seven, right? And that was kind of the issue last year. They have all these blue-chip pass rushers that have come in and they haven't been developed. Blake Baker's scheme is going to allow for these guys to eat. So, yeah, would a loss in Las Vegas, change my perception? Absolutely. But I think what LSU has done over the past few months in the recruiting front in the high school ranks, Cooper, they have our #1 player in the class of 2025 committed in Bryce Underwood. They got our #3 corner committed in DJ Pickett. I think there's reason to believe. On USC, I wanted to ask you about this. They got some wide receivers that I think fans don't know about, right? Some guys that have been inside that program. Zachariah Branch, Mekhi Lemon, Jacoby Lane. It sounds like the early returns on those three are pretty good, and that should help Miller Moss.
Not to mention Deuce Robinson, right? And you think about what they've added in the backfield to Quinn Joyner, another guy that we liked, had a really solid freshman season. That's the biggest question mark. LSU 105 in total defense last year. USC 116. DeAnton Lynn comes over from UCLA, like his coaching chops a lot. And then you got Blake Baker, as you mentioned, one of the more hot up-and-coming names in all of college football. Something's got to give.
It's like the Spider-Man meme. Right? They're both looking at each other.
Very, very similar in terms of where they are, their kind of trajectory. We'll see what happens. Both teams need that game. Let's end on this one. Drew, Notre Dame, Texas A&M in College Station. I love this game. I kind of wrote down. It kind of reminded me 2022. Utah, Florida, Anthony Richardson in the swamp. I just feel like people are going to be excited. First-year head coach Mike Elko, obviously very familiar with Notre Dame, spent some time there. Drew, this game, Connor Wigman, Riley Leonard, but there's another transfer that we should probably keep an eye on, especially with today's news. Charles Jagasaw, the projected starting left tackle for Notre Dame, torn pec on his right side, going to be out for the season. So mix and match. That's a big deal because on the other side of that, Nick Scourton, one of the best transfers in all of college football, 10 sacks last year in the Big Ten at Purdue.
Nick Scourton, member of the top 247, a guy we saw very late in the process. And Coop, anyone that follows our work or listens to us knows we're looking for individuals where the arrow is pointing up. All right, Nick Scourton went by Nick Carraway at the time at the All-American Bowl. Kid committed to Purdue. We loved him, shot him up in the rankings. Look at him now. I think he is kind of the key to the game. And Texas A&M, back in 2022, right, they signed the highest-ranked recruiting class ever. The strengths of that class was the defensive line. Now, some of those guys have left and transferred other places. Some of them are off in the NFL. But I wonder about Notre Dame's ability to keep Riley Leonard's jersey clean because Nick Scourton's coming around the corner against a very green offensive tackle. You also got guys like Shamar Stewart, Shamar Turner, DJ Hicks. I think it's going to be a low-scoring game, and I think the pass rushers for Texas A&M are going to dictate how this one goes.
I mean, one guy that you could not afford to lose for Riley Leonard and for Notre Dame, maybe the most important player outside of Riley Leonard, was going to be Charles Jagasaw, a guy that we were really high on, one of the top tackles just a year ago. Had a tough Sun Bowl, but expected him to bounce back, especially with the fall camp under his belt. Drew, not just Texas A&M, but Tennessee. We're going to talk some recruiting. We're recruiting guys. We're going to talk about that after the break as the Vols land the #1 player in the country in 2026. Reason to celebrate in Rocky Top this past weekend, as on Saturday, Tennessee landed the #1 prospect in the country per 247Sports, Faizon Brandon out of North Carolina. Drew, I kind of just want to just give you the floor and just let you go because you love this kid, and we put this kid as the #1 player in the country a few months ago, a guy that we wanted to ride with. Why is this guy not only the #1 player, and then on top of that, tell me what you think about the fit in Knoxville?
Well, it's a combination of things, right? He's got prototypical size. He's got elite dual threat athleticism. And then you dig into his sophomore season. Statistically, it's as clean as you want, right? He leads the top 247 when it comes to his completion percentage. Interception rate, only 3 turnovers there as a sophomore at Grimsley High School. And then he's tested exceptionally well for a player his size. 4.8 in the 40-yard dash, 4.5 short shuttle. Coop, we always want our quarterbacks to also play another sport. Faizon Brandon's a kid that almost averaged a double-double on the hardwood. We got a chance to see him at the Future 50. And for those that are not familiar, it's a camp where they bring in some of the top underclassmen from around the country. Faizon Brandon threw alongside, 6 other of the quote-unquote top quarterbacks there at IMG Academy. It was a hot morning. Me and you were there sweating it out. I thought Faizon was the most consistent of the bunch, and I came out of that workout thinking, okay, this guy is the alpha. Why? Because all of his peers kind of treated him in that sense. Now, the fit at Tennessee, I love this, Cooper. Faizon Brandon from the same area in North Carolina as Hendon Hooker. Remember what Hendon Hooker was able to do in Josh Heupel's offense there in Knoxville? He's a guy that could beat defenses with his arm and his legs, and he could get the ball out fast to the numbers. I think Faizon Brandon, if you're a Tennessee fan or someone that follows football in the SEC, think of Faizon Brandon as Hendon Hooker, but there's more to the player. There's more, a higher ceiling. There's more developmental upside. So it's early. Coop, right? Faizon Brandon has only played 1 year as a starter. He's still got 2 years to go. But based on everything we know in this 2026 class, we think he's the guy that has the best chance at this stage to emerge as a potential franchise player. And for Tennessee, that's huge because that is, 2 can't-miss quarterback prospects in a 4-year span. Nico Iamaleava and then Faizon Brandon. And they've sandwiched some guys we like in between as well, Jake Merklinger and George McIntyre.
So how impressive in the transfer portal eras where you got 4 guys all from the high school ranks where you're like, all right, we're going to build this organically. We're not going to go outside of our walls to find our next signal caller. Now, you mentioned it, you got Nico, you go down the list, you got Jake Merklinger, obviously George McIntyre in 25, and now you got Faizon Brandon in 26. That's not a situation you see too much in college football nowadays.
It isn't, Cooper, and I've been trying to find another program that has been able to do this. Yeah, we like Ohio State's quarterback room heading into the upcoming season. How many of those guys transferred in? Will Howard, Julian, Sayin. Lincoln Riley has had a ton of success at Oklahoma. I think that when he had Spencer Rattler, all those guys, Caleb Williams, we've seen it a little bit at USC. But again, you're talking about transfers. For Tennessee, I mean, this is a huge coup, right? In the sense that you're not having to go pay the premium for a veteran quarterback out there, right? Yeah, the price tag that gets thrown around is what, $1 million? We heard that last night from a Power 4 staffer. That's what it costs. And yes, you have to pay these high school guys, but they're a little bit cheaper. And I think they fit the system. That's the other thing. So I think Tennessee, in this new age of recruiting, their ability to not only identify the quarterback prospects, but then build the relationship.
Josh Heupel, one of the best quarterback recruiters in the country. I think that's fair to say. He's earned that right over the last 3 years. Tennessee, hot on the recruiting trail. Final thoughts right after the break. The 5th annual Player Personnel Symposium starts later today in Nashville. Drew, an event that we love. Obviously, we've established that we are recruiting / player personnel guys here on this podcast. But if you don't know what the Player Personnel Symposium, it's where all of college football support staff in recruiting and player personnel flock to Nashville every year. I like to call it the Logo Olympics as well, for good reason. But Drew, every year you learn something a little bit different. They have a great host of speakers. But a lot's changing, right? We get to hear a lot about the rule changes and what's happening. It seems like every year there's something big that's getting ready to happen. Well, next year, how about the revenue share, right? That's going to be the topic of conversation. But some other things out there as well, 85 to 105. What are you looking forward to hearing from the most?
Well, Coop, yeah, you said it, 85 to 105. So how college football, has always operated. You get 85 scholarships. That number is going to go up to 105 and 20 additional spots. I'm really interested to hear, how the people that, run the top programs around the country, the college football playoff regulars, how do they plan to attack that? You get those 20 additional spots. Are they going to treat it like the practice squad in the NFL? Are you going to place a premium on certain positions? If I was running a department, and I know you were as well, it would be interior defensive linemen and offensive tackles. Why? Because those guys come with a price tag in the transfer portal. But is someone going to try to roster 6 quarterbacks? Right now, the standard's kind of been 4. So that's something I got an eye on. Hey, you're speaking at the event, so what do you what's on your mind heading into it?
How do you keep everybody happy, right? You talked about 85 to 105. Sure, what I think it's going to do is going to take a lot of pressure off premium positions, right? Your secondary, I think that's the first one that kind of comes to mind. Your offensive line as well. Inside linebacker is another one where you rely heavily on those guys for special teams. But the bottom of the roster, the guys outside of that, how do you keep those guys happy from a financial standpoint? And then what's the trickle-down effect for the group of 5? I can see it on the front end, possibly hurting those guys, but also those guys benefiting from that as well. The revenue share, Drew, we've talked about it already. I think that's going to be the topic of conversation. It's kind of crazy. I don't think the normal fan really knows kind of what's coming down the pipe, but a year from now, this is going to look a lot more like the NFL than what we've seen in a very, very long time, ever, right? So that's going to be fascinating as well. But salary cap management, do they bring in, what do you do, right? Yeah, it's a different place that they've never gone to before. So I'm kind of interested to hear, what are the innovative ideas in trying to address this?
And the other thing, too, new trends that are coming. I'm all in on 13 personnel, 3 tight end sets. Been hearing that a little bit. So I think tight ends are making a move up recruiting boards.
Tight ends making a move up recruiting boards as well. Drew, the last thing here, week 0, anybody keep your eye, Florida State, Georgia Tech, does that game kind of tickle your fancy at all?
Haynes King, Eric Singleton, Georgia Tech, they're kind of spicy.
Georgia Tech, yes, Georgia Tech getting it going. Drew, a couple other things as well. And the last thing I'll mention here before we get out of here, guys, please make sure to go to the 247 Sports YouTube channel. We appreciate you joining us today. For Andrew Ivins, I'm Cooper Petagna. We'll see you back here next Monday.